One of the first things I want to ask you about this is a background question about why people choose the creative um, vein, medium that they do choose. Because there are so many options out there, of course. You know, there's painting, there's poetry, there's filmmaking, there's all sorts of stuff. And every medium has its own characteristics, naturally. And we're drawn to one of those things or several of those things. So what was it about? Is it about the short story that draws you in comparison with the other possible forms, both in writing and what else you might have done as a creative person?
I think that the first thing that comes to my mind is that because I'm a writer deeply embedded in both prose and poetry, the short story is a halfway house between poetry and prose, between the way prose goes on and between the way poetry encapsulates. And both sides of my nature, my I suppose prolix, going on about things and weaving various strands together, comes into some kind of a marriage with my desire to make every word count in the short story.
Yeah, that's really interesting, isn't it? Because some people would see a clear division between prose and poetry. But to talk about that on a line of distillation is an interesting thing of thinking of, a way to think about that. And the virtue of the short story is you can't go on too long, so it brings out that distilling process more. Yeah, yeah, I can understand that, and that's true of your work. But what's particularly interesting about this book, and I assume about your writing of stories generally through time, is that they're very diverse. And when you first sent me the manuscript, you told me you were a bit concerned about that whether the book hung together as a whole because of that diversity. I actually think it's a strength because the different kinds of story are strong in their own terms, and the contrast between them enliven the whole reading experience, I'd say. Can you say something about what draws you to taking such clearly different approaches to story writing?
I'm looking for answers to that question myself all the time. Recently, I went on an 11-week road tour and camping tour to the north of Australia with Andrea, my partner. And our habit is, as we drive, to read a book aloud. And I do the reading aloud while Andrea does most of the driving. And we struck upon Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse. And that's a real challenge to read aloud. There are so many tones and so much irony and so much going on in every sentence. And they're so interminably long too as sentences. But anyway, what struck me is that Virginia Woolf's on a vein. Virginia Woolf knows what she's aiming for in style, in voice, in positioning her writing in relation to life, and positioning her writing in relation to modern art too. And she goes for it. But I find, and there are many writers like her, you know, Murakami is another one who knows the vein he's in and he follows that vein. And they're precious veins, the Virginia Woolf, the Murakami veins. And they're the kinds of writers I've been drawn to read and read again and read lots of. But when it comes to my own work, I do seem to range restlessly across, you know, the academic essay, the personal essay, poems, prose poems, fiction, the short story, and whatever. Not diary writing, not so much, but across all those forms. And sometimes I say to people that really, if I was left alone on that desert island that 9 billion of us on the planet imagine one day we might be left alone on, what I ended up doing is writing poetry, because really in the end that's all I can do. I revert to poetry. But I read prose, I read fiction with great appetite, and find myself wanting to write it. So I'm just restless. I have a restless mind, have a restless spirit, and I fall into the short story because the idea I have seems to demand a short story at times.
Yes, I actually buy that restlessness. Absolutely. Life is short and there are things to do that are fascinating, and being hidebound in a given form. And I think a lot of writers, actually, a lot of artists too, lose themselves in repeating the same ideas again and again. It's very hard not to, of course. We're limited, we have limited sensibilities. But I think that's really, really germane to explaining why you do what you do. I mean, when you talk about some writers having a vein that they explore again and again, and as I agree with you, it can be a wonderful thing because that individual sensibility is so engaging in that search they're on. And often you'll meet different sorts of characters within their writing, different psychological and social situations. But one of the things you do also within the short story is that some of them are more distilled, a form of distilled realism that's very poignant, and some of them are more fable-like or even absurdist in their approach. So I wonder if it could have anything to do with your having taught creative writing for so long. Could the diverse way of thinking that a good teacher has to apply to help their students in a non-prescriptive way, for them to be able to develop and find out who they are, do you think that could have affected your outlook on writing?
Early on in my adult life, I vowed never to become a teacher, and I ended up becoming a teacher. And as a teacher, I tried, at the cost of being crude about it, there are two kinds of creative writing teachers. Maybe there are two kinds of teachers. There's the creative writing teacher whose agenda is, if you write like me, you will get high marks. Or, if you value what I value in creative writing, you will get high marks. Then there's the teacher who says these are the options you have as a creative writer. This is the history you're writing against. Go for it. And the teacher steps back, as it were. Now, that first kind of teacher, I think, is the writer being a teacher. And that's perfectly legitimate. It's perfectly legitimate, and it's inevitable. One of the great creative writing teachers in the history of creative writing teaching in Australia was Gerald Murnane, who taught creative writing at RMIT, or connected with RMIT, for many decades. And I remember early on in my writing life, I talked to lots of students, and of course the students that were taught by him said, well, what you have to learn to do is write like Gerald Murnane. And if you learn to write like Gerald Murnane, you'll get high marks in his courses. So I thought, well, I want to learn to write like Gerald Murnane, even if it's just that copying a master school of learning. So I applied to go to Gerald Murnane's classes. And after a while, I got a note back from him saying, I don't think I can teach you much, so I'm not going to accept you as a student. I suspect he thought I wouldn't agree to write like him. But anyway, that was, I've got no fundamental criticism of the writer who says to his class, write like me and you get high marks. I'm not disparaging that. I think it comes out of the school of copying the masters, and there's nothing wrong with that. Whenever Van Gogh had a creative impasse in his life, to fill the time, he went into galleries and copied the masters.
It's interesting though, Kevin. I think I'm less generous in this than you, because I think there's a difference between choosing a story or a painting that you learn from, and then come and go from that, from someone running a course where they teach one way. Because I think inevitably a teacher's job is to tune into who their students are. And I've seen art students have their creativity destroyed by being instructed in an authoritarian way about what is the right way to do things. So I think it's actually important that teachers tune into who their students are and provide the guidance that they need.
Yeah.
I think it's a solipsistic.
Well, yeah, and that they are the reasons that I went the way I went, which was to step back, hardly even let my students know I was a writer, but talk to them about writing and talk to them about options, traditions, history, and context, and ask them to surprise me. But in defense again of those writers who go with an agenda, students are smarter than you give them, than we often give them credit for, and more independent-minded than we often give them credit for. They can suss you out as a teacher.
And part of the creative process is reacting to things you're told, as well as
Exactly.
learning from them.
Exactly.
But I still think it's better if you have plenty of models to choose from.
Yes, yeah. But maybe my failure as a creative writing teacher was that I didn't give them enough to rebel against. I wasn't authoritarian enough. I wanted them to love me. But anyway.
The world is so full of reactive, generational reactions in creative thought, in all thought, that I think sometimes it's a counterproductive force, because we tend to assert ourselves unnecessarily when we react.
Yes, that's true. So I was your, I suppose, quasi-academic creative writing teacher rather than an inspirational teacher. And that says something about my personality too. I think what can I say? I made mistakes early on in my adulthood by overcommitting, I guess. It went straight from school to a Jesuit seminary, totally committed to the 3 vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, and realised after 2 years of that I was overcommitted. And then, I became your typical 1970s rebel, a bit overcommitted to wearing the torn jeans and the long hair and the huge red beard as it was then, and experimenting with whatever drugs I could find. So, and gradually since then, I suppose I've become more skeptical about overcommitting. And my style of writing must reflect that I see a palette, I see choices, I see invitations. I read Kafka and I want to write like Kafka. I read Virginia Woolf and I know I can never write like her, but I'd like to do something that comes somewhere near that level of sophistication. So
that's really interesting. You're not wary of overcommitting to the task of writing. You're wary of overcommitting to one vein within that, and that's really interesting, because I can see how that could come out of your seminary experience. The world is suddenly, there's more than one solution to understanding the world.
Yeah. I was listening to it, but just by with great surprise, I saw Ian McEwan interviewed last night on the 7:30 report by Sarah Ferguson. And one of the points he made was that what he tries to avoid above all else are banalities. And that inevitably, if you become serious about what you're doing, if you try to express the worth of what you're doing as a writer, you'll end up expressing banalities of one kind or another, or generalizations that really don't carry much power. And I guess my restlessness of moving between ways of approaching questions, and also I think my inability to come down or to write in genre, as it were, has to do with my desire to avoid generalities and try to stick with specifics, stick with experience.
That's really interesting. Yes, which probably gives the stories the intense sense of a moment that they have. I mean, one of the interesting things about the stories is that they involve situations that have key points for your characters. They're not exactly tragic ones, and sometimes they're shot through with moments of really quiet clarity and even humor, but they often involve some sort of moving adjustment or understanding for the protagonist or the narrator of the story. But interestingly, this is something that I think is really germane to the stories, is that the reader may be able to see the nuance or reality of that moment, that that key moment better than the characters can. Am I reading that in a way that makes sense to you?
Yeah. I guess that they're thought experiments in one way or another, and both the reader and the writer are placing these figures out in their mise en scene and watching what happens. And perhaps there's a certain detachment that with that kind of approach. I think that I'm not passionately involved, like say someone like Stefan Zweig might be, in the characters' lives. I'm more offering an observation on people's lives.
What's interesting about that, though, Kevin, is what it does, because the reader often can see something that the characters or the narrator of the story can't. It creates empathy. So there's this gentle sense of, oh, they might realize that later, or oh, that's what's happened, or it's not some sort of blinding flash, but there's a growing sense of empathy, I think, that the reader can have for your characters. And maybe that comes from you quietly observing them, but standing a little outside and letting us see them in that way, perhaps.
Yeah, I suppose the great attraction of fiction is to try to understand other people.
Yes.
And that's an attraction the reader experiences, and no less does the writer experience. And maybe for the writer, it's even more puzzling and even more mysterious, because the writer has to move along in the dark and hope for those moments of opening up of what another life might be like, and finding ways to express that.
Yes.
And at the same time, overlaid on that is that all the writers are doing is exploring their own life in the guise of exploring other lives. A number of those stories in the book came to me via things that happened to my friends, or things my friends told me about their lives. And there's two stories in particular there. There's three stories. There's three stories there. They're almost direct, verbatim accounts from my friends and one from my mother of experiences that happened to them. And after I wrote the stories, I went back to those friends and I said, look, I've written this story. I hope I haven't taken too many liberties, but here it is. And if you don't like it, I'm happy to throw it away. I'm happy never to publish it, never to show it to anybody. And one in particular of those, or two of those friends said, oh, I didn't recognize myself in that story. Was it about me?
How interesting.
I thought it was literally about them. So I guess, that things go through that filter that the writer has, and hopefully that filter that I have provides pleasure to the reader.
Yes, it's so interesting. It's the nexus between your own sensibility and looking outward at the world. And inevitably, I think good writers look outward at the world and they find things they think are movingly interesting in the world. But inevitably, it's filtered through their own sensibility. So I can understand why your friends may not have recognized themselves, because their sensibility was somewhere else. Yeah. Yours had interpreted the experience. You're singling out for attention any story from this collection feels a bit disloyal to the others, because we've worked on them together for so long. I feel as though they're part of me in a sort of vicarious way. But I do want to pick out a couple there. Can you say anything about what you were trying to achieve through two key, very different characters? The young woman in Experience, a powerfully realistic story, and The Lion in Love, a fable that draws close to reality, but still is a fable.
To put those, they're two very different stories, and I suppose they illustrate two of the directions that this collection goes in. One, the realist, the intimate realist direction, and the other is that more fable-like direction. Experience, experience comes from, well, who knows where it comes? I don't really know where it comes from. It comes from being in a little town called Girona in Spain, and just seeing that town and seeing what goes on in that town, and wanting to write something in that setting. It comes from a recognition of my own aging and my transition into becoming, I don't know, a senior. Well, I have a card that tells me I'm a senior citizen now, and it gives me all sorts of trivial discounts. So it's my awareness of becoming a senior citizen, becoming an older man or an older man. And
what's interesting there, though, Kevin, just to break in for a moment, is that there's a young woman character who has a relationship, a momentary relationship with this older character. What's really interesting about the reader here, we come to understand that the young woman can't quite know the significance of what she's just experienced. And that's the kind of fulcrum on the moving fulcrum of this story. She's a little bit blasé about it, but not dismissive. But there's a sense, I think it's a beautifully realized story. There's a slight sense that there's something that may yet to bear fruit in this experience that she can't quite understand yet.
And that effect that you're talking about comes out of my admiration for Alice Munro. She's such a superb short story writer. And again, when I read her stories, one of my reactions is, I want to write like that. I know I can never. But this is my Alice Munro homage in that collection. Right. And it's my hope was that kind of effect might come out of that story. That
I think
things are happening than the characters realise.
It's very successful. I think it's a wonderful story that I wouldn't change at all. In contrast, though, or not though, in contrast with In the Line of Love, our lion, the central character, the lion in The Line of Love.
Yep.
The key thing here is this inexpressible restlessness in the face of something unknowable that seems to mirror our own situation. Yes, very different, but do you have anything to say about that?
Well, for a long time I've been fascinated with the surrealists, and I wrote my PhD on the surrealists, and I do think that the fantastic is in fact another form of realism. Mm-hmm. When it's read for its intent and for its psychological truths and emotional truths, or emotional kind of resonance. That's one side of it. I've got no problem with the fantastic. The other thread in that story is my interest in Grimm's fairy tales and Aesop's fables, and they were big books in my childhood, and big books in my experience of parenthood. I read those books aloud, and I read, in fact, Grimm's fairy tales aloud so many times to my demanding children that the book fell apart in the end, and that was something to behold, just to see the book fall to pieces in my hands.
The best fate for any book, isn't it, to be used so much that it falls apart?
Yeah. So I was sitting down with another young writer who I have regular meetings with, and we talk about writing, and we challenged each other to write a fable. And so I was flicking through Aesop's fables and came across The Lion in Love. And so with that in mind, I began writing about experiences in my street that I could not write about without giving them the heavy disguise of fabulism and fantasy. And that story emerged. And
yes, wonderful. I mean, I love that coincidence of things. And one of the interesting things about what you've just said is that you think the surreal is closer to realism in some ways. And I think that's probably why your story works, because surrealism as an art movement, while it was fascinating, often it pushed the boundaries of playing with the idea that the surreal was almost a replacement for any other form of thought.
Yes.
And where I think it's where it's most potent is where it connects with other forms of thought, where it actually draws, where we see the absurdity in life is where it reaches its most potent point. And I think that happens in this story really well.
Yeah. I think that the other element that drew me into that story is that we do live not very far from the Melbourne Zoo, and we can hear the lions, and that's its own surreal experience, to be in a highly urbanised environment and suddenly hear the call of lions coming up the valley.
I love it. It's wonderful. So, Kevin, I think probably the last thing I want to ask you, unless you have some things you want to say beyond, is my role as a publisher. I wonder how you feel about being edited. And this isn't me seeking you to tick some box that I've done a good job or not. But there are so many stories about writers who refuse to change a word when they write. They don't engage in the editorial process. And there are other stories about overbearing editors who intrude too far. And we've probably heard many of those. I'm interested in the question of how reasonable it is for an author's vision to be manipulated by a publisher, so the book has a better chance of commercial success, for instance. Do you have any view about this and about the editing process in general and its role in writing?
I suppose commercial success is something that happens inexplicably to some writers, and there's no formula in the end for why Stephen King and not some other horror fantasy writer might have made all those millions of dollars, or why certain literary writers hit the jackpot and others don't, who are equally interesting. So there's no, I think, that early on in my writing life, people used to say, why don't you write books that sell? And I used to ask myself that question seriously. Why don't I write books that sell? But what I've realised is that most writers just want to get by. If they can get by on their writing, they've done a pretty good job of it. And that's a very lucky thing. So I'm sure, for example, Helen Garner didn't write in order to be commercially successful. Helen Garner wrote because that's all she could do, and to get by as a writer, because that was her ambition. And she more than got by in the end. But who knew that was going to happen? And what editor knew that they were, editing her to a formula? So I'm confident that you weren't editing me for commercial success. What you were editing me for was to make the stories the best stories they could be, in the light of both our wisdoms as readers
and in their own terms.
Yeah.
And not in the terms of a story I would have written, in their own terms. And that's, I think, the most fascinating thing about editing. It's a privilege to be able to go inside someone else's work and try to understand it in its own terms and help them realize it.
Yes.
It's a fascinating thing.
And one of the great values of your editing the work was that you left me room to think about the stories again, and to think about stories that I thought I had already thought about. One of the stories in particular, the story of the writer at the festival meeting a woman in the foyer afterwards, history of Bert Sienna. I didn't realise that story was really about his son until long into the editing process, long into our discussions about how that story ends. And I was distracted by the conversation that the writer and the woman were having too much, I think. And it took me a long time to come to an understanding of really what was on that writer's mind, what was on that man's mind.
Yeah, it's really interesting because the collection is very even in quality, but that was one of the weaker stories. And interestingly, I think you're realizing that through the process meant that it has become a story that's whole now. Yes, which is wonderful that that's possible. And of course, the trouble with being a writer, one of the central problems of being a writer, is you live in your own head, and it's
Yeah.
it's very difficult to get feedback on what you do. And so, yes, I'm really glad that we didn't rush that process, and you could come back and rethink things, and I could prod you a bit in that. It's a wonderful luxury, isn't it?
Yeah, you need, and you need, as a writer, you need someone who's willing to go with the directions your imagination has taken you. It takes some willingness to be fanciful, willingness to be whimsical, willingness to be unpredictable, willingness to take U-turns, to let imagination lead a story. And you were terrific at letting that happen, rather than pulling me back to something more, I don't know, logical or realistic.
Yes, one of the principles I think that's so basic here is that a book has one chance to become itself, and then it's on the shelf or not. It may not even get published, but once it's published, there it is, and you can't go back to it. And maybe you don't want to, you move on to new things, but you want to give it the best shot you can while
Yes.
it has a chance, while it's in embryo.
Mm.
You want the fetus to form in the best and grow in the best way possible, don't you? So I hope in the end you feel that the stories, I mean, I think you probably could have gone on tinkering even longer, Kevin, but
I'm sure I could have.
I hope you think that they've reached a happy point where you can leave them behind and move on now.
I do, and I'm very, very delighted with the book as an object. It's so beautifully designed that it's going to be a great pleasure to give them to friends, to see friends with them, to see them in the bookshops on the shelves.
Well, that's great, because we care so much about books as an artifact, and it's wonderful that you feel that way. And yes, well, thanks, Kevin. Unless you have anything else you want to say, I think we might wrap it up there.
Okay, yeah, good. Thank you, Julian.